Today we are going to talk about three methods you've probably used: attribute reader, writer, and accessor. Let's start by showing off how they work. We'll create a pet class and add an attribute accessor for the name attribute. Then we create an instance of this class. The attribute accessor created the name equals method for us, so let's assign a name to our pet. Now that it has a name, we can retrieve it calling the name method. Finally, if we inspect this object, we can see that an instance variable called name has been defined. That's how we use attribute accessors in Ruby. Ruby also provides an attribute reader, which only creates the name method, and an attribute writer, which only creates the name equals method independently. But how do they work behind the scenes? To understand how this all works, we'll create our own reader, writer, and accessor. Let's start with the writer. We need to open up the object class in order for our writer to be available on every object in our system. We'll create a class method called attribute writer that receives the attribute name and, for now, just prints it out. Now we can create our pet class and create the name attribute using our new method. And when we execute this code, we can see that it printed out the name symbol. Now that we have the attribute writer method defined at the class level, we need to define the name equals method. At a first glance, we could do this with def, since that's the standard way of creating methods in Ruby. If we do it this way, it works, but it gives us no flexibility on the method's name. So we switch to the find method, which receives a string that represents the method's name as an argument, and a block to which we yield the method arguments, and where we define the method's body. This does the same thing as before, but now we are receiving a string that we can manipulate as we please. For example, we can name it after the attribute name. Now we can define any attribute writer we want, and it works as expected. So far, we have our attribute writer method, but it doesn't actually set a variable. We can do so by calling the instance variable set method with the name of the variable as the first argument and the value we want as the second. And now, when we run this code, we can see that our attribute writer defined the name and age instance variables as we intended. Now that we are able to set an attribute in our class, we can start writing the attribute reader to retrieve it. The same as before, we start by creating the attribute reader class method that receives the attribute name as an argument. Then we dynamically define a method named after the attribute. Note that this time we don't need to use interpolation, since the method name is exactly what we get as an argument. Finally, we fetch the instance variable name as our attribute. Now we can add attribute readers to our pet class and try them out. Now that we know how to create attribute readers and writers, we are in condition to write our attribute accessor. As we've been doing, we start by creating the class method. But since we have already implemented all the functionality we need, we can implement it by utilizing our attribute writer and reader, and refactor our code to use our new accessors, which deliver the expected results. We often rely on attribute readers and writers, and it's easy to consider them just Ruby magic. Understanding how they work under the hood not only deepens our grasp on the language, but also equips us to create our own custom tools. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and I'll see you in the next one.